Okay, thanks Olga, and welcome everybody from Hobart, Australia, where it's 8 a.m. at the moment, just past 8 a.m. Not really a morning person, but I've had my coffee, so hoping it'll all be okay. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about this project because I really enjoyed working on it. I learned a huge amount myself, so I'm really keen to share that with people. These slides are online, so you're welcome to play along as we go through. You're also welcome to share the link with anybody, and it's already there in the chat, so you can click on the slides and follow along. Okay, so as Olga said, this was the project, and here are links to various bits of information about the project. It was funded by the IIPC, and I'm very grateful for that. Led by Andy Jackson at the British Library. So thanks, Andy, for sort of having the idea and putting it through. And it was also a partnership with the British Library, the National Library of Australia, and the National Library of New Zealand. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Olga, Andy, Ben, and Alex for your help on this project. In terms of what we were aiming to do with this project, it was really intended as a sort of starting point for researchers. And I mean researchers who want to make use of web archives, who want to sort of go a step beyond just trying to restore broken links. But researchers who might not necessarily think of themselves as sort of digital researchers, so who don't necessarily want to engage with all the sort of exciting possibilities presented by the scale of web archives, but really want to make use of web archives, ask the same sorts of questions that they might ask of any sort of source. You know, questions like, well, what's the context of this? Where does it come from, and how does it change over time? So those basic sort of questions we might ask of any source in any sort of format. How do you begin to ask those sorts of questions of resources available through web archives? We also, in this project, wanted to make use of readily accessible sources of data. And I mean accessible in terms both of being online and open, but also, I suppose, in terms of size. So we didn't want the sort of first step in this this process in using these notebooks to be that you know you have to download many gigabytes of data in order to get started. We wanted to make use of existing APIs. APIs, unpacking the acronyms as we go, is an application programming interface, which means that basically your computer can ask another computer, a server, for information about a resource, and it gets it back in a machine readable form, in a form that computers can understand, and it can therefore do something with it. The advantage of working with APIs in the context of web archives is that we can ask for slices of data and do something with it as we get it back. So rather than have you know, terabytes of data or many petabytes of data available through web archives, we can ask for little pieces, do something with them, use it, analyze it, explore it without sort of overwhelming your computer. In particular, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the APIs that we used. There's a thing called the Memento protocol and CDX APIs. And it's really interesting, and one of the things I've really learned through this project is the amount of data, the richness of data that you can get through these existing APIs. And going along with that, I suppose, is the idea that you shouldn't sort of need special tools to get started. That you can basically just, well, get started with your web browser, as you'll see. And we also wanted to complement existing projects, things like Archives Unleashed. So Archives Unleashed is doing a fantastic job of working on introducing researchers to those bigger questions, you know, those possibilities of scale that you get, the different types of questions that you can ask of web archives at scale. So hopefully the notebooks that we've developed for this project are a bit of a pathway, getting people starting to work with web archives, and if they do start to appreciate or understand the possibilities, they can take advantage of projects like Archives Unleashed. Okay, so as Olga said, the project made use of these things called Jupyter Notebooks. If you haven't met Jupyter Notebooks before, they're things that you view through your web browser, as we'll see, and we'll see several examples. The interesting thing about Jupyter Notebooks is that they combine text, so you can talk about things in a sort of typical sort of tutorial sense, but they also embed live code. So they can actually do things. So it's not just reading, it's actually doing things. They do just run in your browser, so you don't need to have special software installed. And you can set them up, as we'll see, to run in the cloud. So you just click on a link, your notebook opens, you can start to do things. And the thing that most excites me about Jupyter Notebooks, the thing I find really interesting, is the fact that they can be both tool and tutorial. As I said, you have all the introductory text and documentation, and you can walk people through the various steps in working with data, but you can also actually embed the code, the tools that actually do things. So instead of just having a sort of tutorial over there that you have to work through and then you have to go over somewhere else and start to do things, you're actually doing it all together. You're learning as you're doing. You're doing real things as you're actually stepping through the possibilities. And that to me is really interesting and exciting. And it means people can get started in different sorts of ways. So, if they just not interested in the code at all, they just want to get some data out. As you'll see, it's just a matter of sort of working through a notebook, clicking on cells, and not worrying about the code that you see, and the data will be there. The next step from there is if you start to think, okay, well, how does this code work? Where might I adjust it? You can start to do that. So there is sort of pathways through Jupyter Notebooks which enable you to take advantage of them, no matter what your digital skill level is. So very quick introduction to Jupyter Notebooks. So this is what a Jupyter Notebook might look like in your browser. As you can see, you've got text up here. You've got the things in boxes down here with the square brackets next to them. They're the code cells, so you can see they're sort of distinguished from the text cells. As I said, you can run the code cells. And in order to run a code cell, it's really very easy. You click on the code cell to sort of activate it, and then you just hit Shift Enter. You hit Shift Enter, and that's all that's happening in this little animation. Hitting Shift Enter on the cell, and it runs the cell. And in this case, it's giving you the really important information that 1 + 1 = 2 is actually a true statement. So Shift Enter. If you're using Jupyter Notebooks, you'll find yourself hitting Shift Enter a lot. And it's one of the main things you need to know when you're running them, really. Of course, in many cases, and you'll see it through the Jupyter Notebooks that are available through this project, you'll want to edit some of the cells to put in some information, whether that's you're adding a keyword to a search, or adding a URL that you want to retrieve. And in that case, to edit a code cell, again, it's just a case of clicking on the cell, doing your editing, and then when you're finished, hitting Shift Enter again to run that cell that you've changed. So clicking on cells, hitting Shift Enter, that's the basics that you need to start working with Jupyter Notebooks. And I'm not being facetious there. That's really it to get started with Jupyter Notebooks. Clicking and hitting Shift Enter. Okay. And you'll actually, and as we go on and see some of the Jupyter Notebooks, you see there are even some which are even easier than that, because we can present them in different sorts of ways. But that's the basics. Okay, so as Olga said, the notebooks that we've created for this project are now available through this thing called the GLAM Workbench. So the GLAM Workbench is something I've been developing over a couple of years now, and it's a collection of Jupyter Notebooks which help you work with a variety of different types of GLAM data from different institutions. I think there's well over 90 notebooks, I think, at the moment. And they are mostly focused on Australia and New Zealand at the moment, reflecting my own interests and work. But there are some which are broader, and obviously the Web Archive section is really exciting because it brings in a range of repositories, can be used across a range of repositories. Within the GLAM Workbench, if you start to explore, you'll find that there's quite a variety of different sorts of notebooks. Some which are pretty much just standalone tools, or some which are tutorials, some which look more like apps, like web apps, examples, and just sort of little quick hacks around problems that I've come across. And that diversity of types of notebooks, and it's also reflected within the Web Archive section, is important, I think, because it recognizes that people are going to approach this sort of work with different levels of digital skill. So having those, perhaps something which is a web app, which they don't need to sort of see any code, they can just run something and get something out of it, is a great starting point for somebody who really doesn't have much experience in terms of using GLAM data. On the other hand, just having a little bit of sample code that somebody can copy and lift and modify is great for somebody who obviously has some experience in coding and just wants to go in and grab that example. So having those range of different sorts of notebooks, I think is quite useful. And it means that I tend to, in some cases, I will sort of work through documenting things in significant detail as a tutorial, but other times when I just come across a new data source or a new little hack around something, I will just sort of put it into a notebook and share it, not necessarily with huge amounts of documentation, just so it's there in case somebody is looking for that sort of solution or that sort of approach, can just go in and grab it. Okay, so the result of this project is that we have a nice new section in the GLAM Workbench, a Web Archive section. And if you open up the Web Archive section, you'll see a number of notebooks. Actually, I think it's 15 notebooks. I can't remember now. In the Web Archive section. So this is an example of an entry in the Web Archive section, the name of the notebook up there, and a little description of it. I did want to point out a couple of things about this. The first is actually that bit there, which says works with. So that gives you an indication of which archives I've used in developing that notebook. As I said early on, this project was a partnership with the Australian Web Archive, New Zealand Web Archive, the UK Web Archive. So I've been working with data from those institutions in developing the notebooks, and also included the Wayback Machine, the Internet Archive, because of course it is very open and accessible. So some of the notebooks work with, I mean, a number of the notebooks work with all of those systems. Some of them, for various reasons, will only work with some of them. And each of them has that little line underneath, which gives you an indication of what repositories they work for. Now, even though I'm saying that they only work with those, that I've only worked with those systems in developing the notebooks, a lot of Web Archive systems actually work with a set of standards. They're sort of baked into the Web Archive software, and so with relatively few modifications, many of these notebooks could be adapted to work with other Web Archive systems. So it's, in many cases, it'll just be a case of doing a few edits to the notebook to put in the URLs of another Web Archive, often the notebooks need to know whether the Web Archive what software the Web Archive uses, whether that's PyWeb or Open Wayback. So you may need to include that information in the notebook, but that's basically it. You know, if it knows the URL, knows the system that it's using, if it's one of the system that it recognizes, so PyWeb or Open Wayback, then the notebook should work with that Web Archive. So I'm hoping that you know, the Web Archives or researchers using other Web Archives will take these notebooks and modify them to work with a range of different repositories. And there is one of the notebooks I did just as a little experiment does include the Icelandic Web Archives, which, as I said, was quite a simple matter to include. So please take the notebooks and modify them and see what other repositories we can add. The other thing to note about those entries in the GLAM Workbench is that you have a series of links underneath each notebook. So these first two links, download from GitHub, view using NB Viewer, are both ways of seeing the notebook, seeing the contents of the notebook, but they don't allow you to actually run the code. So the first one, obviously, you can see the notebook within GitHub, which is great if you want to download it and do things with it yourself. NB Viewer is a tool provided by the Jupyter project itself, which renders a nice version of the notebook if you want to just share the notebook so somebody can actually sort of see it. It's a good way of sharing them, but you can't do anything with the code cells. So you can click and hit Shift Enter all you want and nothing will happen because it's just a static HTML version of the notebook. The final link down there, the one that says run live on Binder, is, well, does what it says. It runs the notebook in a live computing environment. It does this by using a service called Binder. So Binder is, well, it started as a research project in Europe from a group which was concerned about making research data science reproducible. So not only sharing sort of papers and sharing code, but also sharing the computing environments within which the code runs. So what Binder enables you to do is to set up a customized computing environment and then launch your notebooks within that environment. So when you click on that link within the GLAM Workbench, what happens is you go over to Binder. Binder looks in the GitHub repository for that project. It looks through a configuration file within that GitHub repository. It uses that configuration file to install all the software that you need. And then it launches that custom computer just for you and loads your notebooks within it. So it means that I can share the notebooks for this project, but I can also share the environment, all the software that's needed to run those notebooks. And you don't have to worry about any of it. You can just click on the link and it will load. Now, a few sort of things to be aware of in doing that. One is that it can take a while for your notebooks to actually start up when you click on that Binder link. You can expect to wait for sort of 30 seconds or more while all that happens in the background. You know, there's a lot going on. You know, Binder is, like I said, creating a computer just for you. So be patient. You can click on this little show button on the Binder page, which has a sort of running log of what's going on, so you can actually just check that something is happening. In most cases, like I said, it'll be 30 seconds or so. If it has to rebuild from scratch the repository, which shouldn't happen because I normally do that as part of my process in terms of updating the notebooks. But if it does have to rebuild from scratch, that will take a bit longer, and you'll see lots and lots of messages in that log window. But in most cases, yeah, sort of 30 seconds or more. Be patient because it's doing a lot of work and it's a fabulous service. You know, what it means is that you know, you have that opportunity with the Jupyter Notebooks to just do a quick exploration, just to dive in and see how it works without really having to think about anything in terms of the software or the computing environment. So it's ideal for sharing things like these Jupyter Notebooks, because it means that, you know, thinking again about our aims of having a starting point for researchers, it means they can actually just see, not only see the possibilities, they can actually explore the possibilities. They can take advantage of the possibilities just by clicking on that binder link. So that immediate feedback, that immediate return that they get from exploring those notebooks. Now, so Binder's a fabulous service, but there are limits, and you need to be aware of those limits. One is that if you sort of walk away from your computer for like 10 minutes or more, that your notebook's going to be closed, your server's going to close down, you're going to have to go back and start again in terms of clicking on that binder link. Most importantly, any changes that you make to the notebooks, any data that you harvest, they're not going to be saved. So you can't sort of click on the binder link, do some work, go away, come back, click on the binder link again and expect all that data and those notebooks that you changed to just be there. They're not going to be. You know, as I said, it's creating a new computer for you every time you click on those links. So there's nothing that's saved between those sessions. So that means you have to be aware that if you are doing real work, if you are creating data sets, that you download them, basically. It's pretty simple. And there are a number of download options throughout the notebooks within the Web Archive section. You'll see as you work through them, they generally result in a link or a zip file or something like that, which you can download. It also, these notebooks by default open in a thing called Jupyter Lab, which is just one way of presenting Jupyter Notebooks. And it includes like a file explorer on the side. We'll see an example in a minute. And that also enables you to download files or data as you produce them. So just keep that in mind if you're using Binder. Like I said, it's really convenient. And often I will just click on a Binder link to use one of my notebooks, because I just can't be bothered going and finding the notebooks and running Jupyter and stuff on my own computer, because it's just so quick and easy. You have to, I suppose, also in this space, you know, if you're getting serious about notebooks, if you want to create your own notebooks, if you want to change and edit existing notebooks, if you're harvesting large quantities of data, then you might think about sort of what comes after Binder. So instead of just relying on that cloud service, you know, installing the software on your own computer, which means having Python, installing Jupyter, that sort of thing. It's not difficult, but it is, you know, that extra step. Binder is, as I said, low barriers to entry. Anybody can get started. If you're going further than that, then you need to think about what you need to set up on your own system. And there are there's some information about all this within the GLAM Workbench itself. Okay. So let's have a look at some of the notebooks. So there are three main themes, which I've sort of divided the notebooks up into. Types of data, harvesting data and creating data sets, and change over time. Types of data. So this, you know, I've learned a huge amount in this project. And in particular, I've learned about the data that's available through Web Archives. You know, both the sort of richness and variety and the amount of data that you can get out of the existing APIs. So there are two in particular that we're making use of. One is a protocol called the Memento protocol. And it's a sort of standard which most Web Archive software or presentation software complies with. And Memento really is a way of accessing a Web Archive by date, I suppose. So there are these things called time gates. And if you query a time gate with a URL and a date, the time gate will give you back information about the capture of that URL closest to that date. It may also give you back some extra information about the captures that it holds of that URL. So that's really useful if you just want to get an individual capture from around a particular point of time. Another thing you can get back are things called time maps. So where the time gates give you back those sort of individual mementos. So a capture is a memento. time maps can give you back the list of all available captures for a URL. And there may be quite a lot of captures of a URL over time. So you can get back quite a lot of nice structured machine readable data through these protocols. The other API that we made use of is called a CDX API. So easiest way to think of CDX is that it's an index of Web Archive captures. So every time a URL is captured by a Web Archive, it creates an entry in the CDX index. You may think, well, how is that useful to a researcher? Well, the sorts of information that it captures as it's doing that are things like, obviously, the URL that it captures, the time that it's captured, the result of the request, so whether it's a success or whether it's a 404 not found error. You can get the size of the resource that was captured. There's a thing called a digest, which is like a fingerprint, indicating which uniquely identifies a capture. So you can see, by comparing digests, you can see if captures have changed over time. You can see when that web page has changed. So putting all that together, there's quite a lot of useful information for analyzing things like change over time relating to a particular page or within a particular domain. And we'll see a few examples of those throughout. So taken together, the Memento protocol and the CDX API provide a lot of useful data for doing real research using Web Archives. And the great thing about them is that, as I said, they're basically baked into a lot of Web Archive software, things like the Memento compliance and the CDX API. So as I said, even though these notebooks are designed to work with a particular set of Web Archives, they could be easily extended to work with others because those protocols, those standards are baked into the software. Okay, so this is an example of one of the notebooks within that sort of first theme, the types of data. So even though, and now this is the sort of where the qualifiers come in. So even though they're using the Memento protocol and it's basically a sort of standard, there are some variations in the way that's implemented within different systems, different software. So what I did was I went through the repositories that I was working with and just documented what happened when you made the different sorts of requests, and therefore identified where the variations were. So this notebook is really just working through the Memento compliance of the different systems and understanding where the differences are. So I went through, looked at time gates, looked at time maps, summarized the differences between the systems, and then wrote a bit of code which basically sort of smoothed out the bumps between the systems so that in the other notebooks, as we'll see, you can make requests to the different repositories and not worry too much about those variations. So the next set of notebooks really took advantage of that work and explored how you could use those sources of data. So the first two listed there, that get the archive version of a page closest to a particular date. So that's obviously using the time gates. So it's just taking what I documented and the code that I built there and applying it to particular cases. Similarly, find all the archive versions of a web page is using either time maps or the CDX API, because you can do that using either data source. But again, building on that documentation and those sort of example bits of code that I created in those other notebooks to apply them to a real situation. So they're the sort of basic examples. And then I sort of went and developed some more complex examples of what's possible. So for example, one thing you might want to do as a researcher is just collect text from web pages that you can then sort of analyze in sort of, the text analysis program of your choice. So this notebook will extract text from a single URL, a list of URLs. It'll get all the captures over time, extract the text from them. But you can also using the CDX APIs, which enable you to do sort of some filtering of URLs. You can get sort of other sets. You can assemble a set of URLs and extract all the text from them. So we can have a little look at that in action. So if I just go away. Okay, so this is a live Jupyter Notebook. This is sitting on my computer, not on Binder, but it would look just the same if you were running it in Binder. As you can see, we've got some text up here documenting what the notebook does, and then we've got these sort of big blocks of code down here. So I'm just going to start running these code cells. As I said, click on the cell, hit Shift Enter. That's all I'm doing. When you hit Shift Enter, it sort of automatically moves you to the next cell and activates it. So I don't need to click on that cell again. I can just hit Shift Enter. In fact, I can just keep hitting Shift Enter going down the page. And that's all I've done, is just hit Shift Enter several times there. So you can, as I said, sort of get all the text from all the captures of a single URL or a list of URLs, or we can look at a particular set of URLs within a domain. So the CDX API enables you to work at a domain level rather than at the level of an individual URL. So you can, there are different types of queries that you can use with the CDX API. So this is called a prefix query. So what it's basically doing is looking for all pages, URLs, captures, which fall under this domain, which is DFAT, which is the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia, dfat.gov.au. So it's all the ones underneath DFAT. You can also apply other filters using the CDX API, for example, to say that you only want successful captures, so ones where you've got, you know, a success code in response. You can set status code to 200. This one, MIME type text HTML, says that we only want HTML pages, so we don't want images or JavaScript files or anything like that, just the HTML. And you can also do quite nifty things like filtering by the URL itself, or by words within the URL. So this is like a little regular expression here, which is saying that we only want URLs which include the word policy in them. So altogether, what this is going to do, it's going to get a list of URLs which are available within the dfat.gov.au domain, which are HTML pages, which were successfully captured, and which include the word policy in the URL. So as a first step, it's going to assemble all of those URLs. It's going to find all those URLs using the CDX API. And then once it has them, and let's just start it off because it takes a little while to do that. And then once it has them, it's going to go, look up each individual URL to get a list of captures of that individual URL. And then it's going to access the page, the archived page from each of those captures, and extract the text from them. Now you have a choice here. There's a parameter filter text equals true, and that basically says whether you want the whole text of the page, which includes things like navigation and footers and stuff, or just the sort of significant text. And the notebook makes use of a software package which has a number of algorithms which it uses to identify what is the sort of significant text within a page. So you can see there now it's started harvesting individual URLs. And if we look in the text directory here, so these are the URLs that it has captured. And in this case, there's only actually one capture available for this file. So this is the text file, if you open up that. So that's the text that's extracted from that capture. And there's a little metadata file as well, which records information about what's being captured from that URL. So these are the mementos, individual captures from that page. So it's going to chug away. And so that's the other one it's working going at the moment. So there's a number of captures in this one. So there's 27 captures of this URL. So it's going to go through each capture. So you can see there's different ways you can actually make comparisons here. So we're comparing both between URLs, so we could compare the text between different URLs, but we can also compare text between captures of an individual URL to see that change over time. So different ways we can analyze these sorts of things. Okay, so that's one example. Another one of a more complex sort of workflow. This one, again, use the CDX API to find PowerPoint files within a domain by filtering by the type of file. It then converts those PowerPoint files to PDFs. It extracts screenshots of the title page and the text from the PDFs. And then it saves it all into an SQLite database and opens it up using dataset for exploration. So you can then search it as a database and it shows the images and all that sort of stuff. So it's really a sort of complete workflow as how you might work with a particular type of data from a web archives. So it's a bit more complex, but you know, it just shows you some of the possibilities there of working with different types of files. And this one is, like I said, you know, we're working with manageable chunks of data, so things like, you know, using the APIs, but I thought it'll be interesting to try something a bit bigger as well. So I did, just using the CDX API from the Internet Archive, try to get a list of unique URLs from, or unique subdomains within the gov.au domain, the Australian government domain. So, you know, it's possible. It took a couple of days. I ended up with about 60 gigabytes of data, which I then had to sort of process to remove duplicates and things like that. But it is possible. And I was able to do some basic analysis and visualization of the gov.au domain. These sort of pretty pictures are sort of like a failed attempt at visualization in that they're really dendrograms and they're actually made up of the text of the subdomains. If you zoom in, so there's an example zoomed in down there, it's actually the actual names of the subdomains there, but there's so many of them that, you know, when you sort of zoom out to a size you can actually fit on your screen, they're just sort of like these black sort of hairy spiky things. But they look pretty interesting themselves. So, you know, I was quite taken with those. And in fact, you can get them on a t-shirt because they look so cool. So if you want to brand yourself as a lover of web archives, you can get your own gov.au t-shirt. Exploring change over time. So that's obviously one thing that a researcher approaching a web archive is going to want to do, is different ways you can sort of understand how particular pages or domains do change. And there are a number of ways you might do that. Again, looking at the text content of a web page, for example, you might want to see how, you know, different versions of a page, you know, what text is introduced or removed from a page over time. And that's what this notebook does. Now, I just want to point out with this notebook, you might see that the link here is a bit different. It says run live in app mode on Binder. And that's because it uses an extension called app mode, which basically turns your Jupyter Notebook into a little app. What app mode does is it hides all the code cells and then it runs all the code cells automatically. So a user approaching something in app mode basically just sees an app. You know, it's got you know, drop down boxes or widgets or whatever that they can interact with. They don't actually see all the code that's running underneath the notebook. So we have something like this, and indeed we can have it see the live version of this. So this is what it looks like when you open it up in app mode. When you click on that link in the GLAM Workbench, you can, if you want to see the code underneath, see the notebook, you just click on Edit App, and it'll open it all up, and so you can see the code. Let's just do a quick example here. So this is coronavirus page from the UK government. I'm just going to paste that URL in there and hit this button. So what it's going to do, it's going to work through, it's going to find out all the captures of this page, and it's just going to work through them one by one, comparing the previous version with the current version and looking for any differences in text. So it just keeps chugging away. As you can see, there's a lot of captures of this page because obviously it's been changing a lot. And it shows you what the changes are, what's been removed, what's been added, what's changed in the text of each capture of that page. That's going to keep going for a while, so I'll just leave it. But one of the things it does, and thanks to Andy Jackson for this idea, is that you can actually feed it parameters in the URL. If you want to point somebody to a particular page in a particular repository, they can be incorporated as parameters in the URL. So if somebody just clicks on the link, it opens up the notebook in Binder. So not only does it do that, but it also populates these fields with the repository and with the URL, and then automatically starts producing this sort of comparison. So you can actually share the comparison, the analysis with somebody, not just the notebook. And once this completes, and it's going to take a long time to complete, it'll actually include at the bottom of the page a share URL, which includes those parameters in it. So you can just grab that URL, give it to somebody else, and it will open up and start doing this automatically, which is pretty cool. Another way of looking at change over time is comparing how the web pages look. There's a number of notebooks which make use of screenshots, full page screenshots. One which looks at a single page over time. Another one which you can use to compare either versions of a single page, or you could use it to compare different pages if you wanted to, or you could even use it to compare the same page in different repositories if you wanted to, if that was interesting or useful to you. The screenshot code can be a little bit flaky because it's doing things in the background like spinning up a headless version of Firefox. So if it doesn't work the first time, just try it again. It usually works, but just sometimes, and with some particular web pages, it might run into issues. There's just, a lot of variation in the way web pages themselves are structured, which can in some cases cause problems, but most cases it will work. Another question that somebody might ask, a researcher might ask, of course, of a web archive or of a page within a web archive, is when does a particular phrase, piece of text, name, for example, first appear within a web page? And that's what this tool does. Again, as you can see, it's another web app. It uses the app mode to present the notebook. So it's just a matter of choosing things from the drop-down lists. It has a couple of options in that you can find either the first occurrence of a particular piece of text, in which case it sort of starts as far back in the past as it can and then comes forward in time. Or you can find the last occurrence of a particular piece of text, in which case it starts in the present and goes back until it finds the text. Or you can just find all occurrences, which means it just goes through every capture and looks to see whether that piece of text appears. And it also, at the end, generates a little chart showing the number of occurrences over time. Okay, so just wrapping up. So look, I've really enjoyed working on this project, and I think that it's created some resources which should be of hopefully useful to you, to researchers, to web archives. So I'd love to see people take them, not only take them and use them, but they may also, want to change them, as I said, sort of modify them to work with different archives. They're all openly licensed, of course, so you can take them and do things with them. If you have ideas for other notebooks, or obviously if you have problems, if things occur, I've tried to sort of lock down the environments using Binder and things to try and prevent problems. But if things do occur, obviously, as they do from time to time, please let me know. Probably the easiest way of tracking these sorts of things is if you go to the GLAM Workbench to the Web Archive section and click on, you'll see up the top corner, there is a link there to the GitHub repository. If you click on that, you go through to the GitHub repository, and there's an issues tab there, and you can go in and raise an issue, whether that's you know, an enhancement request or an idea for a new notebook or for a problem that you've come across. That will help us both, you know, keep track of what's going on, and also, you know, think about what we might do in the future in terms of new notebooks. Okay, so thank you very much. Please go away, make use of them. You know, I want to stress that you can't break anything if you click on those Binder links. The worst that will happen is that Binder will just sort of stop and close your little virtual computer. So, you know, it's really there. All of the notebooks in the GLAM Workbench are there for you just to start exploring. So I encourage you to do so. And I'll now hand back to Olga.